The most important sweetener in human history wasn't honey from bees. It was honey from fruit. When the Bible promised a land flowing with milk and honey, scholars now say that honey came from dates, not hives. It's lower on the blood sugar scale than bee honey, and it carries serious potassium. However, almost no one tastes it anymore. It all starts with the Sumerians. The Sumerians, living in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, had about 150 different words just for the date palm and the parts of it. That sounds like overkill, but it tells you something pretty huge, because they needed that many words for one reason. The palm was their everything. They called the tree Gishimar. Their kings carved it into temple walls and called it sacred, and old Assyrian carvings show kings standing right next to the palm like they're posing with a god. The whole region treated it as the tree of life, dropping fruit you could mash into a thick, dark syrup that lasted for months without going bad. So why would they care that much about one tree? Because when you boiled those dates down, you got the closest thing to liquid sugar that ancient humans had ever tasted. This thick brown syrup served as their honey, their candy, their preservative, and their travel food all at once. Iraqis later called it dibs. The Hebrew Bible called it devash, and the modern word in Israel today is silan. Different names rolled off different tongues, but the recipe barely changed for 4,000 years. So if this was the honey that fed Babylon, Assyria, ancient Israel, and the entire Fertile Crescent, why does almost no one in your local store sell it today? And why have we let bee honey, which only became cheap thousands of years later, completely steal its name? Now flip open the Bible, open the Hebrew Bible, and the word honey shows up over 50 times. There are rivers of honey, lands flowing with honey, and honey running down rocks. That sounds incredible, but it raises a strange question. Ancient Israelites barely kept bees. There's almost no archaeological proof of large beehives in biblical-era Israel until much later. So when God promised Moses a land flowing with milk and honey, what honey was he actually talking about? The Talmud answers this directly in the section called Ketubot 111b. It explains the verse this way: milk flows from the goats, and honey flows from the figs. Honey flows from fruit. Rashi, the most famous biblical commentator in Jewish history, was even more blunt. He connected biblical devash to dates and figs, not bees, which means the real flow was thick fruit syrup. That single fact shifts the whole picture of the Promised Land. The land wasn't dripping with hive products. It was dripping with thick, dark fruit syrup squeezed from one of the 7 sacred species of the region. Dates were already growing wild near Jericho and the Dead Sea. Roman writers like Pliny the Elder went out of their way to praise Judean dates as the most prized in the empire. In 35 BCE, Mark Antony Feasible gave the Jericho oasis, the heart of Judean date country, to Cleopatra as a gift. So the sweetest line in the Bible was actually about a fruit. Yet somehow this got translated, repeated, and pictured for centuries as buzzing honeybees. Why did the real sweetener get erased from the story? And how does a fruit syrup get hidden inside a phrase everyone still quotes today? Then comes King Hammurabi. Around 1754 BCE, a Babylonian king named Hammurabi carved 282 laws into a massive black stone. You probably already know one of those laws, since it's the famous eye for an eye rule. But hidden in that same stone is law number 59, and it's about a tree. The law reads, if a man cuts down a tree in another man's orchard without permission, he pays half a mina of silver. Half a mina is around 240 grams of pure silver. In a world where most workers earned a few shekels a year, that was a brutal fine. Why is it so harsh to chop one tree? Because in that part of the world, the tree was almost always a date palm. The orchards Hammurabi protected were date orchards. His code goes on in laws 60 through 65, with rules about gardeners planting, training, and pollinating these groves for 4 full years before the owner takes his share. Mess with the palms, and the law came down hard. That's how seriously they took it. A king ruling from the Tigris all the way to the Mediterranean coast wrote tree protection into his legal code because dates fed the cities. Date syrup sweetened the food. Date wood built the boats, and the leaves even wove the roofs. Pull one palm down, and you ripped a chunk out of someone's pantry for a decade. The Sumerians before him took it even further. They cracked the secret of hand-pollinating palms over 4,000 years ago, climbing up the trunks and brushing male pollen onto female flowers with their bare hands. That same method is still used by farmers in California today. So a tree built laws, kingdoms, and Roman trade routes. However, the part nobody talks about is how anyone actually turned those dates into syrup in the first place. Now imagine making this stuff at home. The recipe is almost insultingly simple. You pit the dates, cover them in water, boil them slowly for hours, then strain the juice through cloth. The thick brown liquid is reduced over heat until it gets glossy and pours like motor oil. It sounds way too easy. The real catch is how many dates you actually need. About 2 pounds of fresh dates gives you roughly 2 cups of finished syrup. That's a wild amount of fruit for one small jar. Iraqi grandmothers used to do this on rooftops, in massive pots, stirring for hours under the sun, and the smell would fill an entire street. Once made, this syrup could sit in a jar for months without spoiling or turning into rock-hard crystals like bee honey does. The sugar level inside it was so high that germs couldn't grow, which meant it doubled as a preservative for other foods. People dipped bread in it for breakfast, mixed it with sesame paste to make what's basically the original peanut butter and jelly of the Middle East, poured it on yogurt, stirred it into stews, and even gave it to babies as a first sweet taste. In Iraqi Jewish homes, this syrup made the original charoset, the sweet paste eaten at Passover. The late food writer Gil Marx argued that date charoset predates the apple version most Western Jews eat today by roughly 1,000 years. So the very symbol of slavery and freedom on the Passover plate was originally a paste of date syrup. And yet, in most Western kitchens right now, this exact same syrup sits in exactly 0 cabinets. So what does science actually say when you put date honey head-to-head with bee honey? Time to compare date honey to bee honey in real numbers. A 2023 peer-reviewed study published in the journal Foods tested date syrup made from barhi dates on real human subjects. The result was a glycemic index of 55, which is low on the blood sugar scale. Bee honey usually sits around 58. Other studies on traditional Dibs syrup measure it as low as 47. Either way, date honey lifts your blood sugar more slowly than bee honey. The mineral side is where it really separates. A 100-gram serving of date syrup carries around 217 milligrams of potassium. Bee honey carries almost nothing in comparison. Date syrup also brings calcium, magnesium, iron, and a stack of plant antioxidants called phenolic compounds. Bee honey is mostly sugar and water in a fancy jar. But the most surprising study came from Cardiff Metropolitan University in 2015. Researcher Hajer Taleb tested date syrup made traditionally in Basra, southern Iraq, against 4 nasty disease-causing bacteria. The syrup killed Staphylococcus aureus, E. coli, Enterococcus, and Pseudomonas, every single one of them. The real twist is the speed at which it worked. Date syrup finished the job in about 6 hours. Manuka honey, which costs a fortune in health stores, and is famous for fighting bacteria, took longer to do the same job. The lead researcher, Dr. Ara Kanakanian, said date syrup's antibacterial activity was, in his exact words, similar, or in some cases, better than honey. A cheap fruit syrup from Iraq just outperformed the world's most premium honey in a Welsh University lab. There's one more thing nobody tells you about this comparison. Bee honey comes from bees, and date honey comes from a tree. If you skip animal products, this is the sweetener your grandparents would have reached for without thinking. So if it's measurably better than honey, where did it actually go? And who killed the world's first sweetener? But everything changed for date honey when cane sugar finally arrived. Sugarcane first reached the Middle East around the time of Alexander the Great. By the 12th century, Phoenician merchants were running cane sugar plantations near the city of Tyre, in what's now Lebanon. That single shift changed everything about how the region ate. White cane sugar gives you the same sweetness with way less effort. You didn't need to boil pounds of fruit for hours. You didn't need a palm grove that took years to mature. You just bought a sack. Sugar was the iPhone of medieval kitchens, faster, cleaner looking, and aggressively cheaper as plantations spread across Europe and the Mediterranean. Then came the industrial age and the knockout punch. Refined white sugar was produced at insane scale, and high fructose corn syrup arrived in the 1970s and made sweetness almost free. Why would a busy mother boil dates for 6 hours when she could spoon white sugar into her tea for pennies? So slowly, silently, date honey slid from everyday staple to weird grandma food. Even in Israel, where dates have been part of the 7 sacred species for thousands of years, commercial Ceylan production barely existed before the 1980s. Until then, you only got Ceylan if your grandmother made it, and grandmothers, eventually, stopped making things their grandchildren refused to learn the recipe for. But sugar wasn't the only thing that killed date honey. Something far worse hit the actual trees. A real-world disaster in the country that was once the king of the date world struck the killing blow. Whole landscapes of palms got physically wiped off the map, and the cause wasn't farming gone wrong. It was tanks, rockets, and dried-up rivers. Then came Iraq's catastrophe. Iraq was once nicknamed the country of 30 million palm trees, and that's not a poetic phrase. That was the actual, measurable count. Hundreds of varieties of dates, some say 450, some say 600, all growing along the Tigris and Euphrates, the same rivers that fed Mesopotamia 5,000 years earlier. In 1980, the Iran-Iraq War started, and it ran until 1988. The fiercest fighting raged along the Shat al-Arab waterway, the river marking the border between the two countries. That waterway was lined with the densest date groves on Earth. According to traders in Basra, the majority of those trees were burned to ash by shells and rockets, and whole forests vanished in single nights. Official Iraqi estimates put the decline at roughly 50% of pre-1980 numbers. That's half the palms, just gone. Some areas, like parts of Basra province, dropped from 6 million trees to under 3 million. The 2003 US-led invasion piled on more damage. Drought came next, hitting 4 years in a row, with summer temperatures reaching 50 degrees Celsius, which is 122 Fahrenheit. Rivers dropped, salt crept into the soil, and trees turned yellow and died standing up. Date trader Salem Hussein, who's been selling dates in Iraq for 40 years, told reporters, "We thought of developing and doubling the number of palms, but the figure only falls. We hoped for a better future, and it got even worse." In a cruel twist, most dates sold in Iraq today come from trees that originally took root in Iraq decades ago, before being replanted in other Gulf states. So the heartland of the world's first sweetener got cut down by war and dried out by climate change. And yet, against all that, something insane happened in a quiet desert lab. A 2,000-year-old seed came back to life. Which brings us to Methuselah. In 1963, archaeologists digging at Masada, King Herod's fortress beside the Dead Sea, found something strange buried in the rubble. Old date seeds, sealed under stone, still in one piece after 2,000 years. They got stored in a researcher's drawer in Tel Aviv and pretty much forgotten for over 40 years. In 2005, Dr. Elaine Saloe at the Arava Institute decided to try the impossible and plant the ancient seeds. Radiocarbon dating later showed they were roughly 2,000 years old, dating from somewhere between 155 BCE and 64 CE. By all the rules of biology, this should never have worked, since seeds aren't supposed to stay alive that long. After 8 weeks, one seed cracked open and sent up a green shoot. They named the plant Methuselah, after the biblical figure who lived 969 years. Today, Methuselah stands over 10 feet tall at Kibbutz Keturah in Israel's Arava Desert. Guinness lists it as the oldest seed ever brought back to life by human hands. The story gets crazier from there. Saloe's team went back, found 32 more ancient date seeds at Masada and Qumran, the site of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and 6 of them sprouted. Methuselah turned out to be male, but 2 of the new trees were female. One of them was named Hannah. On September 7, 2020, Hannah, pollinated by Methuselah's pollen, produced fruit. Her first harvest was 111 dates, and the next year almost 700. These were the first dates of the ancient Judean strain to ripen in roughly 2,000 years. Dr. Saloe described their taste as, in her words, lovely with a honey aftertaste. So the very dates the Bible called honey are growing again, from seeds that watched the Roman Empire rise and fall. Ceylon is back on Israeli supermarket shelves. Iraqi farmers are replanting groves across the south. And the next time someone says, land of milk and honey, you'll know exactly what that honey really was. Some sweetness gets buried under cheaper sugar and louder marketing, but the Bible's real honey survived a 2,000-year coma. Maybe it's time we tasted it again. Subscribe for more buried history.